its results are similar to exploding a block in AutoCAD. In general, this tool is typically avoided by most Revit users. In this movie, we'll discuss the tool and why it's typically avoided and under what rare circumstances it would be considered acceptable. So I'm in a file here called Explode. I'm looking at a floor plan that's been linked in, and the first thing you want to know about Explode is that when you have a linked file, you cannot explode it. So when I select this, notice that the Explode option is grayed out. That right there is one of the reasons why a lot of CAD and BIM managers will actually recommend using Link CAD exclusively, because it eliminates the temptation to explode by simply not having it be available. But let's press on and scroll down here on the project browser and locate under drafting views this detail view. Here I have an imported CAD file, and because it's an import, it can be exploded. So you'll notice here that that button is available, but before I click on it, I want to show you a couple things so that we understand a little bit about why we want to typically avoid this. One of the main reasons we want to avoid exploding CAD files is it tends to junk up your Revit project with lots of extraneous types and items that are not needed by the file. This will serve to cause confusion to the users coming after you in the file. It will tend to balloon the size of the file, and in some cases can even introduce corruption. So for all of those reasons, we typically try and avoid this command wherever possible. But let me show you some of the items that I'm talking about. If I go to the Manage tab, and we look under Additional Settings, we've got lots of things that can be configured here. Among those are things like the line styles. If I look at line styles and I expand this, I've got the default list of line styles here. These are the ones that are created by Revit when you first create the file. The ones with the little brackets are built in, those are always there. And then the ones down here can actually be customized. But you can see it's a pretty limited list. We've got hidden lines, medium lines, wide lines. Let's cancel out of there. Let's look at another example. If I go to the Annotate tab, here on the dialog launcher for text are the text types. Now this list is even more compact than the line styles list. There's only 2 text types currently in the file. We've got 1/4" Arial and 3/32" Arial. So let me cancel that. Now you may be able to figure out where I'm going with this. When I select this file and I click the explode button, what that does is what you might expect. It breaks the CAD file up into pieces. Now, the pieces that it breaks it up into are really just simple lines. You can see here that when I click on these are nothing more than lines here, because even when you explode it, Revit doesn't have the ability to somehow magically convert this into proper model object categories. So it just comes up with line objects that match what the drawing looked like. And as you can see over here under line style, this is the same list that we looked at a moment ago on the Manage tab. There's all the built-in styles there, but notice all these new line styles that got added to the file that all start with the prefix A. Those came from the layers in the CAD file. So every layer in the CAD file got converted to a line style, which again, you may or may not want. The same has happened to the text. Notice when I select a piece of text here, and if I open up the drop down here, here's the 2 types that we had to start with, but now we've got all these other ones that have the name AutoCAD in front of them. So you're going to get lots of additional types and styles and items that load up the file and again can increase file size and potentially inhibit performance. Notice here that some parts of this detail are still selected as an import symbol. Well, just like in AutoCAD, you can nest one block inside of another. When you explode an import in Revit, it looks at that structure the same way. So if there are nested elements inside the block, either other blocks or hatch patterns and so on, then those become new import symbols that would have to be exploded. Now, if you want to just explode the entire thing in one shot, you can use the drop down here and do a full explode. That will explode all levels deep. It won't just stop at the top level. If I explode this guy, here's another downside to exploding something like a hatch. It's not going to stay a hatch. Revit's going to turn that into a bunch of independent lines and potentially add even more line styles to the file. For all of those reasons, I hope you can see that exploding is not necessarily ideal. And if I go back to the floor plan here, even if this were an import and you exploded it, all you're going to get is lines here. all of these walls won't get converted to walls. They're going to be two separate parallel lines. So it's really not going to be very helpful to try and explode this file to shortcut your way into converting it to Revit. The better way to convert it to Revit is to use the techniques that we talked about in the Convert movie. If you find yourself in a situation, though, where you really just need to explode a CAD file, then here's the recommended workflow. First, go into Revit and create a brand new empty project. Import the CAD file there, explode it there, and clean it up. What do I mean by clean it up? I can select these lines, one or several of these lines, and I can change the line styles to a corresponding Revit type. You want to do that to all the pieces of text. You want to do that to all the line styles. Clean it up. Then you select the resulting geometry and copy it to your clipboard and paste it back into your live project. If you do it that way, you're going to leave behind all of the stuff that we didn't want and only bring over the stuff that you did want. And so that's considered a much better way to perform that process in the cases where it's necessary. When you import or link a CAD file into Revit, Revit tries to interpret the lines and other geometry coming in. Revit simply looks at the layers in the CAD file and determines how to display the graphics being imported. In this movie, we'll look at the process that Revit uses to do this and how we can manipulate that to get desirable results. So I'm in a file here called line weights, and I'm in the level 1 floor plan, and I've got a CAD floor plan already linked in here. And what I'm going to do is just start to zoom in a little bit here, and as you can see, this file has line weights displaying quite nicely on screen. All the walls are in a nice dark line weight, and the doors and the other fixtures are a little bit lighter. How did Revit know how to correctly interpret that information coming from CAD, particularly when most CAD files actually use a combination of layers and colors to determine those line weights? So if I take you over to AutoCAD, and we look at this same file and zoom in on the same area, you'll see that none of those line weights that we were just looking at are displayed here. What we see instead is a bunch of colors. To understand the way that this works, let's open up the layer dialog box. Now, when I open up layers, you can see all of my layers listed here, and then in the color column, you can see that most of these layers are either magenta or yellow. However, look a few columns over and you notice the line weight column. A lot of AutoCAD users don't actually realize that AutoCAD has a line weight feature, or they just simply choose not to use it. But in this particular drawing, line weights are being used, and they've been assigned to all the layers. And so even though I have several layers here that are set to the magenta color, you can see that several of them are using different line weights. This one here for the glazing frames is actually 0.30, where the glazing itself is 0.18. If we were using just simply the magenta color, the entire window and its frame and glass would all come out to the same line weight. And in fact, that may be what we would get from AutoCAD if we printed with a plot style table. But because we've got the line weight feature here, we can override that color and use the line weight instead. If Revit sees the line weight in the file, it looks no further. It simply uses that line weight directly over on the Revit side. I'm going to switch back over to Revit, and let's open up another file. Over here under drafting views, I've got a view called details. I'm going to open that up and zoom in a little bit here on this detail. If we look at this detail over in AutoCAD, and I've still got the layer dialog box open here, you can see the detail there in the background and all of its layers listed. But notice this time, all of the line weights are set to default. This means that Revit can't use the line weight feature to determine how to import this data. It has to instead rely on the colors. And so what's going to happen now is Revit's going to take each of those colors and assign them to a line weight. Now, when we switch back over to Revit, what we see here when we're zoomed in is there aren't any line weights really being used at all on this detail. Everything is kind of flat and lifeless with a single thin line weight. The reason for that is we were using the default mapping table here. Let's look at where this mapping table is. I'm going to go to the Insert tab, and on the Import panel, there's this tiny little icon right here. If you click that, that opens up the Import Line Weights dialog. And what you'll see here is a long list of color numbers on the left and the corresponding line weights that are going to be used for those colors on the right. If you look at the very bottom of the dialog, there's a note that says these values only apply to lines and layers that are set to the default line weight in the source DWG file. And that's why the floor plan came in with line weights automatically, but the detail did not, because the floor plan was using line weights in its source file, but the detail was set to default. So for the detail, we have to go through this list here and look for the colors that are being used in the detail and assign line weights to them. Now I've already done this work for us, so I'm going to go to load. I'm going to click this detail line weight and assign there color number 31. Back in the CAD file, color number 31 should be a pen weight 3. And then if we scroll down a little further, somewhere around pen number 131, you can see that that should be a pen weight 5 and so on. You don't have to assign all 255 colors, but you do have to go through the CAD file and assign all of the line weights that are actually being used and the ones you want to change. So when I do that and I click OK and I select this file, let me delete it, zoom out just a touch, and we'll bring it in again. I'm just going to do import for this. Choose my AutoCAD detail. It does take a little bit of effort to set up that color mapping table the first time, but the good news is that most firms use a standard list of colors for all their details in their Office Standard. And so once you set up that file once, you can simply save it as a color mapping table and then use it for any detail that you import. Just a couple other things I want to point out here, that there's a few other things that may get lost in translation when you bring in the CAD file. Notice that these arrowheads are displaying on the leaders, but down here there was a couple arrowheads and those are not displaying. These arrowheads were actually a custom arrowhead that was just made from polylines. Those won't display. Revit doesn't interpret those polylines with thickness correctly, so you'd have to draw those another way in CAD or add them back here in Revit. Over here, you can see that this note looks a little different than this note. Back in CAD, this note uses the Simplex font, which is an SHX font. SHX is an AutoCAD-only technology. Revit doesn't understand what an SHX font is, so it's substituted a TrueType font in its place, and in this case, it used Arial. These up here, we're using Arial Nano. If you want the fonts to display a certain font, you're better off actually going back to AutoCAD and changing all the fonts in AutoCAD first before you import them to Revit, because there's really no way to change them after the fact. So you can get desirable and predictable results on the files that you import into CAD, either by using the line weight feature from CAD first and Revit will read it directly, or by building a color mapping table to establish all the line weights ahead of time so that when it gets imported in, they will map correctly to your desired Office standard. Importing or linking CAD files into Revit is often performed as a temporary or transitional measure. Might be used as a starting point to create a new Revit detail. However, it is also common for CAD files to be left as a permanent part of the Revit project. In other words, some parts of the project are modeled in Revit, while others remain simply drafted and embedded CAD files that get printed right alongside with the Revit project. Such an approach is not without its disadvantages, and there are some who do not favor the approach at all. However, it is a common scenario that you're likely to encounter as you transition to Revit, and so in this movie, we'll take a look. So I'm in a file here called Hybrid, and it's a Revit model of an art gallery. All of this area here has been created with Revit geometry, but in this area here, there's going to be an outdoor sculpture garden. And let's assume that that was created by an architect who's using AutoCAD, and they're a consulting architect for our firm. We have two choices. We can either take the AutoCAD file that they gave us and we can try and recreate it all using Revit geometry, or we can just simply bring that CAD file in and embed it right here in the Revit project. And that's the scenario we're going to look at right now. So I'm going to zoom in slightly into this area here, go to my Insert tab, and we're certainly going to want to use the Link CAD feature for this type of thing because we're going to want to be able to maintain the ability to reload that CAD file if that consulting architect makes changes to their design. So I'm going to go to Link CAD, select my sculpture garden, maintain the ability to see the 3D geometry of the sculpture garden in any view that I happen to look at. I'm going to change the colors here to black and white because I'm going to keep this as a permanent part of my Revit project so that it prints consistently with the rest of the project. I'll go ahead and use all the layers and let it auto-detect everything. And then for the positioning, you really want to coordinate this with the consultant. If you're both using the same origin point, then you should be able to choose auto origin to origin. Otherwise, you're going to have to choose center to center and just move it into position into the correct location. Let's go ahead and try the origin to origin option and see if our consulting architect used the same origin point as our project. So I'm going to go ahead and click open here. And you can see that the sculpture garden came right into the exact location where it was supposed to. So our consulting architect did in fact use the correct origin. Now, if they didn't, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. We could just simply select the linked file after the fact, and then up here on the Modify tab, we could use commands like move and rotate to get it into the correct position. If I go to the 3D view here, you can see that because we unchecked current view only, and I'm holding down my shift and dragging with the wheel, and then I'm rolling the wheel to zoom in, we're getting the full 3D geometry of the sculpture garden, and it fits nicely directly into our project. In 3D, we've still got the color because the 3D geometry is colored, but if I go back to the floor plan view, you can see everything is black and white. When I print the floor plan drawing, I'll get a nice consistent look, and then in 3D, it shows the materials, that orange material being the material that was assigned to the sculptures. The assumption here is that we're going to keep this CAD file as a permanent fixture in the project, and so we're just simply going to use manage links to update it as the design changes. And so this is what we refer to as a hybrid project because some parts of it are Revit and other parts of it are linked CAD files. Just like we can import CAD files into Revit, we can export it. And in this movie, we'll explore the settings and procedures that we use to perform that export. So I'm in a file called export, and I'm actually in one of the sheets right now. I'm in sheet A102 floor plans, and you can see that over in my project browser. What we're going to look at first is the settings that we use to control the export. Remember that we're taking a bunch of objects and a bunch of elements in Revit that know what they are, walls and doors and windows, and we're going to be exporting them out to CAD and basically turning them into a bunch of lines, arcs, and circles. Because CAD uses layers as the primary organizational tool, that's going to be one of the things we're going to want to make sure that Revit establishes correctly. We want it to map all of the objects to the correct layers. So we're going to use the application menu, the big R, go down to export. You can see there's lots of options. And if you slide all the way down to the bottom, you can see there's an item called options at the very bottom. Slide over here and it says export setups DWG DXF. So you really want to start here. This is a big, scary looking dialog box, but the things that you're configuring in here are all pretty familiar AutoCAD stuff. So let's start with layers. The layers tab is here first, and you can see a long list of Revit categories here with the scroll bar. Right next to each of the category names, you can see a layer. Now, if you look at the names of these layers, they're using the AIA format, A-GLAZ, E-Power, and so on. That's because right here it says load layers from standards and AIA, American Institute of Architects, is chosen here. Or you can even do load a settings file if you have a standard that's not on the list. Now I'm going to stick with the AIA and I'm not going to make any changes. But the important thing to realize here is every object in your Revit model will get mapped to a layer that's based on AIA in this case and a color assigned to that layer. So that's the first thing you typically want to look at, so you get all that configured the way that you want. If I click on the Lines tab next, what we're going to see here is all of the line patterns in Revit, things like dash and dash 16, are going to map to some corresponding line style in AutoCAD. You see how it says automatically generate the line type? If you click and open up this list, it's possible for you to scroll through here and choose a line type that already exists and make a direct mapping. You can either let it create new line types for you, or you can map to existing ones in your Office standard. The same is true for hatch patterns. All of the Revit hatch patterns listed here can be mapped to corresponding hatch patterns in AutoCAD, or you can let it automatically create them. You can do the same with text and fonts. So all of the fonts on the Revit side are listed over here, and this is how they map over here on the right. Now with colors, you have two choices. Do you want to use just the 255 AutoCAD color index, or do you want to let it map to true colors? Most people are going to use the color index, so that's the default setting. Solids refers to 3D. If you export a 3D view from Revit, it will either create polymeshes or ASYS solids, so you can choose whichever format you prefer. Units and coordinates, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. What unit system do you want to use? It usually guesses correctly. And then under general, we have a variety of miscellaneous settings. Many of these can be pretty useful. For example, if you've got room objects in your Revit project, you can have those create polylines for you on the AutoCAD side so that people can still calculate the square footage from that AutoCAD file that's generated. If you've got non-plotting layers, you can have it search for those non-plotting layers and automatically make them non-plotting in the CAD side. So that's pretty helpful. And you can have it hide the Revit-only objects that AutoCAD doesn't really need to see. When you get all the settings configured the way that you want, you probably want to come down here and duplicate this setup and give it a name. And maybe call it Office Standard or something like that. Now, because I haven't really made any changes, I'm just going to cancel this. But I highly recommend that you create a custom setup to match your Office standards. Once you have the setup in place, you're ready to export. So we're going to go to the big R again, go to Export, come up to the very top this time. And under CAD formats, we've got all these different formats we can use. Now, if you want to export a 3D model, you could use SAT files. If you're going to MicroStation, DGN, some CAD program other than AutoCAD DXF, and of course, if you're going to AutoCAD, choose DWG. And that's what I'm going to choose. And that brings us here to the DWG export. Now, at the very top left-hand corner, we have a drop-down here that would include all of your setups. Now, I never created my setup, so I only have the default list. If you realize that you forgot to change the settings and you want to change something on the fly, you can actually click this little browse button here and it takes you right back to setups. So you don't have to cancel out everything and start over. So you choose your setup here off the list or configure it directly. The next thing you want to look at is what you're actually exporting. Here, it remembers that I was in this floor plan view. What I want to do is instead of exporting just that one sheet, I want to open up this list and tell it that I want to choose my views and sheets. And when I do that, I have different filtering options of what I can include in the list. So I can include just the views, or I could choose the sheets, or I could choose all of the sheets that are in the model. Now, when I do that, I'm going to check all of them here so that I can export my complete set of sheets. Instead of having to do them one at a time, this can be a big time saver. I'm going to go to Next. It will ask me where I want to save this file. I'm just saving it here on my desktop. The file name isn't actually the file name of the individual file. What it is the prefix to all of the files. So because I'm exporting several files, it's going to use that as a prefix. So I'm going to stick with export, which is fine, but you can change that if you want to. It's going to create 2013 DWG files. And then this setting here is a really neat setting. If I move this dialog kind of out of the way a little bit, in the background, I've got a title block sheet with a viewport on it. Down here, I have elevations and section sheets that I'm also exporting, and those also have viewports on it. What this feature does is it creates one DWG for the sheet itself, sets it up in Paperspace, and then it creates a separate DWG for each viewport, and it XREFs those in and puts them on the sheet. Really nice because that pretty much matches exactly the way that an AutoCAD user would set it up. So let's go ahead and click OK here, and then we'll just wait for these files to process. So when it's done, it'll take you back to Revit, and all that remains for us to do is to switch over to AutoCAD and take a look at what we've got. So I'm here in AutoCAD, and I'll just simply go to Open, go to my desktop, and as you can see here, there are several files that got created. Now these are the actual sheets. Those are set up in Paperspace with the title blocks, and then all of these down here are the XREF files. So I'm going to open up the sheet, Export A102 Floor Plan. Click Open. Let's do a zoom extents. Now, at the moment, it is very bright with these bright colors on a white background. That's simply because the plot style hasn't been assigned to it yet. But as you can see, we're in Paperspace. We've got a title block here that's been created as a block. We've got a viewport here. And inside that viewport, we have a file that has been XREF'd in to represent the building model. So again, it set everything up kind of the way that we would expect. And all that remains for me to do is go to the big A now, under Print, and choose Page Setup. I'm going to modify the current page setup, and I can assign the AIA standard plot style, and I'm going to turn on the display plot styles. When I do that, instead of everything being in color, it'll make it black and white, and so it looks a little bit nicer. It takes a little bit of setup, but once it's set up, it's a fairly straightforward affair. You can take all of your Revit views export them out, and they become separate DWG files complete with title blocks, paper space, and XREF views. It's very handy, and the recipients on the AutoCAD side will appreciate the setup because it will match the Office standards. There are many settings available when you import CAD files into Revit. Some of them are self-explanatory, things like layers and colors, and we've talked about some of those in a previous movie. Some are less so, like the current view only setting. Current view only is used to determine whether or not the CAD data coming in should be interpreted as two-dimensional or three-dimensional. Now, I know the name doesn't really say that, but that's essentially what it's doing. Consider that when you create geometry in Revit, that all of the objects already know what kind of object they are. So an object like a wall, door, or window knows that it's part of the model, and therefore it shows in all views. Things like text and dimensions and notes and drafted entities know that they're two-dimensional and they show in the current view. But when you're bringing CAD data in, it doesn't know how it should interpret that. And that's why the setting is called current view only. So let's go over here to the Insert tab, and I'm going to choose Link CAD, and let's take a look at how this setting behaves. So I'm going to click on the AutoCAD floor plan. We'll see the file come in. I'm in the level 1 floor plan. If I go to other views, you're going to see that that file does not appear. If I go to a second floor plan or if I go to a 3D view, that's because we turned on current view only. To translate that into Revit terminology, what we've essentially said is this linked CAD file is view specific. It belongs to the level 1 floor plan view. So I'm going to select it and delete it. Let's go to link CAD again. I'm going to select the same file, uncheck current view only this time, and then click open again. It looks exactly the same here in level 1, but notice now that if I go to level 2 floor plan, it appears. If I go to 3D, it appears again. Even though the CAD file coming in is actually two-dimensional data, we're still telling Revit to treat it like part of the model. See, Revit doesn't care whether or not it's 2D or 3D. It just wants to know whether or not it should treat it like model or whether it should treat it like view specific. That's why the checkbox is called current view only. So here, this CAD file, even though it's a flat 2D file, we're telling it to treat it like part of the model. So it's going to show everywhere. Now, if there was a view where you didn't want to see it, you'd have to use visibility graphics and hide it. I'm going to delete this file. I'm going to go back to level 1, and let's look at another example. It's important the distinction I just made that what current view only really is doing is telling it whether or not it's part of the model or part of the view, because it doesn't really matter whether the file contains 2D or 3D geometry. We saw that a moment ago because we just brought in 2D geometry. But what happens if I bring in 3D geometry? When I click open, we're going to see it come in. We're looking right down on it. But if I go to 3D, nothing appears. So even though that file contains three-dimensional geometry, that geometry is being ignored because we brought it into level 1 as current view only. So let's delete it and bring it in again. Turn off current view only this time. And then go to 3D. And you can see that the 3D geometry now displays. It makes a huge difference whether or not you check the current view only checkbox or not in terms of what you're going to get. It really comes down to how you plan to use the file. If your intention is to use the 3D geometry as 3D geometry in your Revit project, then you want to make sure current view only is turned off. If your intention is to use it as just flat drawings, like floor plans, for example, that you may want to use with your project or trace over or something like that, then current view only turned on is actually a good setting to have. So those floor plans that we started with, we probably want to have current view only turned on, but this sculpture garden, we probably want to have it turned off. Let's look at one more example. If you want to take a CAD file that contains civil data, like 3D contour lines that represent the terrain of your project, and use that in Revit, you have to make sure you bring it in as model geometry. You have to make sure the current view only is turned off. If you don't, you won't be able to use the feature that allows you to create a topo surface from that 3D geometry. When you go to Link and you select your site plan, make sure that current view only is turned off. It's grayed out right now for me because in the background, I'm in a 3D view. And when you import to a 3D view, you don't get the choice of current view only or not. So in this case, it's actually going to give me what I need automatically. Zoom out a little bit. And if I wanted to take these 3D contours and convert that into Revit topography, then I could go to the Massing and Site tab, go to topography, and use the from selected import instance.